You're listening to the Archetype Effect, conversations redefining power, purpose and leadership for women and the coaches who guide them. I'm Ros Cardinal, leadership coach and creator of the Women's Leader Archetypes. Together we'll explore the real stories, the research and reflections that help women rise with clarity and authentic power. There's a moment many women know intimately, not because they planned it or agreed with it, but because it happened before they could stop it. Someone asks for more time, more flexibility, more emotional capacity, more availability, more understanding, more labour. And before the mind has fully caught up, the answer is already there. Yes, of course. That's fine. I can make it work. And often the moment after is immediate. A tightening in the chest, a drop in the stomach, a quiet internal no that arrives too late. This is one of the reasons boundaries are so misunderstood. Because most conversations about boundaries assume they fail through weakness, lack of confidence, lack of clarity, lack of discipline even. But many women know exactly what their boundary is. They feel it in real time. They know they're over capacity. They know they don't want to agree. They know something important inside them is saying no. And yet the boundary collapses anyway. Not because they're confused, because the moment didn't feel safe enough to hold it. That distinction matters because when a boundary fails in the moment, what's usually happening is not cognitive, it's relational. The nervous system is making a calculation faster than conscious thought. What will happen if I disappoint this person? What will happen if I create friction here? What will happen if I stop being accommodating? What will happen if I say no and the room changes? And for many women, those questions aren't theoretical. The body remembers. It remembers moments where disagreement altered connection, where clarity created tension, where saying no changed how someone responded. Sometimes subtly and sometimes unmistakably. A shift in tone, distance, withdrawal, coldness, disappointment. And because women are often highly attuned relationally, those moments land deeply. So the system adapts. Not because women don't understand boundaries, but because boundaries are relational events. They don't happen in isolation. A boundary is not just a statement. It's a moment where your nervous system has to tolerate the possibility of disappointment, misunderstanding, disapproval, distance, or conflict. And if connection has historically felt linked to safety, that moment carries weight. This is why boundary collapse often feels so confusing afterwards. Because later, alone and regulated, away from the interaction, the answer seems obvious. Why did I agree to that? Why didn't I just say no? Why do I keep doing this? And the temptation is to interpret that as failure. But your body wasn't failing. It was prioritising safety. Not physical safety, relational safety. The safety of staying connected. The safety of staying liked. The safety of not becoming the problem in the room. What makes this especially difficult for women in leadership is that boundaries rarely collapse around things that don't matter. They collapse around care, responsibility, expectation, belonging, around being seen as reliable and supportive, collaborative, capable. So the yes is rarely empty. It often comes from values, from wanting to help, wanting to support, wanting to maintain trust, wanting to avoid creating more pressure for someone else. Which is why so many women feel trapped between two painful experiences: the discomfort of disappointing others and the exhaustion of abandoning themselves. That tension sits underneath countless leadership decisions, not just major ones, small ones. Answering the message late at night, taking the extra meeting, absorbing emotional labour that was never formally assigned, smoothing conflict before it escalates, saying yes before checking capacity, making yourself available when something in you already feels depleted. Over time, these moments accumulate. And eventually something subtle happens. The boundary stops feeling like a choice. It starts feeling inaccessible in real time. Not because the woman has no boundaries, but because her nervous system no longer believes the environment can tolerate them cleanly. And this is where many women become deeply unfair to themselves. They tell themselves they need to be stronger, more assertive, less emotional, less affected by other people's reactions. But this isn't weakness, it's adaptation. An intelligent system trying to preserve connection, belonging, and relational safety in environments where those things have not always felt secure. That's where I want to begin today, not with strategies and not with scripts, not with how to say no, but with a deeper question. What happens when the body experiences boundaries, not as protection, but as risk? Because until we understand that, women will continue blaming themselves for responses that make perfect sense inside the nervous system that learned them. One of the reasons boundary conversations so often fail women is that boundaries get treated like communication skills, as though the challenge is simply wording. Be clearer, be firmer, be more direct, use stronger language, stop over-explaining. And all those things can matter, but communication is rarely the core issue, because most women already know the words. They know how to say, I can't do that. I don't have capacity. That won't work for me. I need more time. No. The real question is whether the body believes it can survive the consequence of saying them. And that's very different. A boundary is not just verbal expression, it's nervous system tolerance. Tolerance for disappointment, for unresolved tension, for being misunderstood, for someone else becoming uncomfortable without immediately trying to fix it. And for many women, that tolerance has been shaped over years, sometimes decades, of relational conditioning. You learn early what keeps connection stable, what keeps people comfortable, what keeps approval intact. You notice what happens to women who are perceived as difficult, too direct, too emotional, too unavailable, too self-focused. You notice who gets excluded, who gets criticised, who gets labelled, and the body learns from all of it, not intellectually, but relationally. This is where many women become highly skilled at anticipation, reading people's tone, tracking reactions, sensing emotional shifts before they're spoken aloud. Again, this isn't pathology, it's adaptation. The nervous system is trying to maintain safety through attunement, which means that in moments of relational pressure, many women don't just hear the request being made, they also hear the disappointment underneath it, the urgency, the emotional need, the unspoken expectation. And once the nervous system registers those signals, the boundary is no longer just about logistics, it becomes relational management. This is why boundary collapse often happens so quickly. The body moves to stabilise the relationship before conscious thought fully enters the room. Appease, accommodate, smooth, reassure, reduce friction. Not because the woman lacks strength, because the system is trying to prevent rupture. One of the reasons this becomes exhausting is that women are often carrying multiple layers simultaneously. The actual request, the emotional tone of the request, the anticipated reaction to the boundary, and then the emotional aftermath they may have to manage if they hold it. That's a tremendous amount of processing happening in just seconds, particularly in leadership environments, because leadership adds another layer, visibility. Women are not just setting boundaries privately, they're often setting them while also managing perception. Will this affect how I'm seen? Will this change the relationship? Will I still be viewed as collaborative, supportive, committed, a team player? And because women's leadership is still frequently judged relationally rather than simply operationally, boundaries can feel socially expensive. A male leader declining additional work may be perceived as prioritising. A woman doing the same may suddenly feel less supportive. Again, not always explicitly, but the body notices subtle relational shifts. Tone changes, distance, reduced warmth, a different energy in the room. And once the nervous system starts associating boundaries with relational instability, something important happens. Women begin preparing for other people's reactions before they even check in with themselves. That's why many boundaries collapse before internal consent has even been consulted. The adaptation is faster than self-awareness. And this is where many women start feeling disconnected from themselves in ways that are hard to articulate. Because over time, responsiveness replaces reflection. The external cue becomes louder than the internal one. What does this person need? What keeps this smooth? What avoids tension? What maintains connection? And eventually, many women stop asking a quieter but critically important question. What is actually true for me right now? This is one of the hidden costs of chronic relational vigilance. The self becomes harder to hear underneath everyone else's emotional signal. And this is why boundary work is not fundamentally about becoming tougher. It's about becoming internally reachable again. Reachable enough to hear yourself before adaptation takes over. Reachable enough to notice your body tightening before the automatic yes arrives. Reachable enough to tolerate the emotional discomfort of someone else not immediately feeling okay. That's very different from simply learning how to communicate better. Because the issue is never vocabulary. The issue is safety. Most women don't consciously think, I'm afraid to set boundaries. The experience is usually much quieter than that. It sounds more like, it's just easier if I do it. I don't want to make this awkward. They're already stressed. It's not worth the fallout. I'll deal with it. I don't have the energy for the reaction. And because these thoughts sound reasonable, women rarely recognise what's sitting underneath them. Fear. Not necessarily fear of conflict itself, but fear of relational consequence. Because boundaries change dynamics. The moment a woman stops over-accommodating, the system around her notices. People who benefited from her flexibility notice. People accustomed to her emotional labour notice. People who relied on her over-functioning notice. And the nervous system understands this long before the conscious mind frames it clearly. It knows that boundaries don't simply protect energy. They redistribute responsibility. And redistribution almost always creates discomfort before it creates balance. That's important because many women expect healthy boundaries to feel immediately relieving. But often, at first, they feel destabilising. Not because the boundary is wrong, because the system is adjusting to a new relational reality. A woman who has spent years smoothing, absorbing, accommodating, or anticipating may suddenly feel enormous internal discomfort the moment she stops. Guilt, anxiety, restlessness, hyper-awareness of other people's reactions. And if she doesn't understand what's happening, she's likely to interpret those feelings as evidence that the boundary itself is wrong. This is one of the ways women get pulled back into self-abandonment so quickly. The nervous system says, connection feels unstable, and the body immediately wants to repair the instability. Explain more, soften the message, offer compensation, reassure the other person, undo the tension. This is why so many women don't just set boundaries. They manage everyone's emotional experience of the boundary too. And that's exhausting because now the boundary isn't simply, I can't do that. It becomes, I can't do that, and I also need to make sure you still feel okay about me afterwards. That's an enormous emotional load, particularly for women in leadership roles. Because leadership often places women inside contradictory expectations. Be decisive, but warm. Boundaried, but endlessly available. Clear, but never threatening. Strong, but still emotionally accommodating. And the body learns to navigate those contradictions carefully. This is where many women become trapped in what looks like high-functioning capability from the outside. They keep delivering, they keep helping, keep absorbing, keep holding emotional complexity for everyone around them. But internally, something else is happening. Resentment begins accumulating underneath compliance. Not because the woman is selfish, because something in her knows she keeps disappearing from her own decisions. And resentment is often one of the first signs that self-abandonment has become chronic. What makes this especially painful is that many women genuinely care. The care is real, the empathy is real. The desire not to hurt others is real, which means the nervous system experiences boundaries not simply as behavioural change, but as identity disruption. Who am I if I stop being endlessly available? Who am I if I disappoint people? Who am I if I no longer manage everyone else's comfort? That's the deeper fear underneath many collapsing boundaries. Not can I say no, but will I still be loved, respected, included, safe, connected if I do? And for women whose nervous systems learned early that connection depended on responsiveness, that question carries tremendous weight. This is why boundary work can feel surprisingly emotional, not because women don't understand boundaries intellectually, but because the body often experiences them as risking attachment. And attachment matters profoundly to the nervous system, which means many women are not just trying to hold a boundary, they're trying to hold themselves together while their body anticipates possible relational loss. That's very different from lacking confidence. It's the nervous system trying to protect belonging. And once you understand that, the conversation around boundaries becomes much more compassionate. Because women stop asking, why can't I just say no? And start asking something far more honest. What has my body learned might happen if I do? There's something important I want to say carefully here. The nervous system will almost always choose attachment before authenticity if it believes attachment is necessary for safety. That's not dysfunction, that's human wiring. We are relational beings. Connection matters profoundly to the body. Belonging matters. Acceptance matters. Relational stability matters. And when the nervous system senses even the possibility of losing those things, it responds quickly, often far more quickly than conscious thought. This is why so many women describe boundary collapse as automatic. They don't feel like they made a deliberate decision. They feel like the response happened before they could access themselves fully. And in many ways, it did. Because under relational pressure, the nervous system is not asking, what is most aligned for me? It's asking, what keeps me connected here? Sometimes the answer is agreement. Sometimes it's caretaking. Sometimes it's emotional management. Sometimes it's silence. Sometimes it's making yourself smaller so the room stays comfortable. And many of these responses become so deeply practiced that they stop feeling like choices altogether. They become identity. I'm just helpful. I'm just someone people rely on. I'm just easygoing. I'm just good at managing people. But underneath many of those identities is a nervous system that learned very early Connection is safest when I minimise friction. This is particularly true for women who became emotionally responsible long before they became formally responsible. Women who learned to read moods early. Women who became the stabiliser in the family, the mediator, the good girl, the capable one, the emotionally attuned one. Again, not because anyone consciously taught them to self-abandon, but because responsiveness was rewarded. And over time, the body began associating self-suppression with relational safety. This is why many women feel physically activated when they attempt to hold boundaries. Their heart races, their throat tightens, their stomach drops, their thoughts scatter. The body is not reacting to the boundary itself, it's reacting to anticipated relational rupture, to the possibility of someone withdrawing warmth, withdrawing their approval, withdrawing connection. And because the nervous system experiences social rejection as deeply threatening, even small moments of tension can feel disproportionately intense internally. This is also why many women over-explain their boundaries. Not because they lack clarity, but because they're trying to reduce the relational impact. They're trying to cushion disappointment, prevent misunderstanding, maintain warmth, signal care. The boundary becomes wrapped in reassurance. I'm so sorry. I wish I could. I feel terrible. I just have too much on. I hate letting people down. Again, none of this is moral failure. It's the nervous system trying to preserve connection while expressing a limit. But over time, this creates something deeply exhausting. Women begin managing not only their own emotions, but everyone else's emotional response to their boundaries too. And eventually the emotional labour surrounding the boundary becomes heavier than the boundary itself. So the body chooses the path of least immediate relational disruption. Yes, even when the cost arrives later. And the cost always does arrive later. Not usually as something big, but as accumulation, mental exhaustion, resentment, emotional numbness, irritability, a sense of disappearing inside your own life. Because every time a woman overrides herself to maintain connection, the nervous system learns something. My needs are less important than relational stability. Other people's comfort matters more than my internal truth. Connection requires self-suppression. That's a painful thing for the body to keep rehearsing, particularly because many women continue functioning extremely well while it's happening. They still lead, still care, still show up, still achieve, which means the depth of the exhaustion often goes unrecognised for a very long time. From the outside, they look capable. Inside, they're carrying layer upon layer of unresolved tension. Not only from what they're doing, but from what they're constantly overriding in themselves to keep doing it. And this is where many women begin losing access to rest, because the nervous system never fully stands down. It stays alert, monitoring, tracking, preparing, not just for tasks, for relationships, for emotional consequence, for tension, for expectation, for the next moment someone might need something from them. And eventually the body stops believing it's truly safe to relax at all. Not because there's any immediate danger, but because connection itself has become something the nervous system feels responsible for maintaining. That's the hidden exhaustion underneath chronic boundary collapse. Not simply doing too much, but carrying the ongoing emotional labour of preserving relational safety at the expense of self. Most women don't need more information about boundaries. They need more safety around holding them. That's a very different conversation, because boundaries don't become sustainable through force. They become sustainable when the nervous system no longer experiences them as catastrophic. And that shift usually happens slowly, not through becoming tougher, not through shutting down emotionally, not through learning to care less, but through rebuilding internal trust. Trust that discomfort can be survived. Trust that disappointment doesn't equal abandonment. Trust that connection can stretch without collapsing entirely. This is one of the reasons boundary work often begins somewhere much smaller than women expect. Not with confrontation, but with pause. A pause before answering. A pause before automatically accommodating. A pause before managing everyone else's comfort first. That pause matters enormously because for many women, the boundary disappears before self-awareness fully enters the interaction. The yes outruns the self. So the first restoration is not firmness, it's access. Access to your own internal response before adaptation takes over. And initially, this can feel surprisingly uncomfortable. Because the moment a woman pauses instead of immediately smoothing, fixing, reassuring, or agreeing, she also starts feeling the tension she spent years navigating around. The awkwardness, the uncertainty, the anticipation of disappointment, the urge to repair the moment quickly. And many women misinterpret that discomfort. They think, this means I'm being selfish. This means I'm being difficult. This means I'm hurting someone. But discomfort is not always evidence of wrongdoing. Sometimes it's simply evidence that the nervous system is practicing something unfamiliar. Allowing another person to have feelings without immediately taking responsibility for resolving them. That's a profound shift, particularly for women who've spent years unconsciously managing the emotional equilibrium of the people around them. Over time, something subtle begins to change. Women start noticing, I can survive someone being disappointed. I can survive tension that isn't immediately repaired. I can survive not being endlessly available. I can survive not fixing the room. And from there, boundaries begin moving from performance into embodiment. They become quieter, less explained, less apologised for, less emotionally loaded. Not because the woman has become cold, but because she's no longer abandoning herself to preserve relational safety. This is also where women begin separating care from self-erasure. And that distinction matters deeply because many women fear boundaries will make them less loving, less generous, less supportive, less connected. But healthy boundaries do not remove care. They restore consent inside care. And that changes the entire experience. A woman can still support someone without absorbing responsibility for their emotions. She can still be generous without overriding exhaustion. She can still care deeply without disappearing from her own decisions. And perhaps most importantly, she begins learning that someone else's emotional response is not always hers to carry. That's difficult initially, especially for women whose nervous systems learned early that harmony depended on them. But eventually, another kind of relationship becomes possible. One where connection no longer requires chronic self-suppression. One where women stop negotiating themselves away in small moments all day long. One where the body begins relaxing because it no longer expects self-abandonment as the price of belonging. And this is where boundaries become less about defence and more about internal coherence. Your yes means yes, your no means no. Your care includes you too. Not perfectly and certainly not constantly, but increasingly. And when that begins happening, something else shifts quietly underneath it all. The nervous system starts carrying less unresolved tension, less monitoring, less anticipation, less emotional residue from all the moments where the self disappeared to keep connection intact. Which matters. Because many women don't realise how much energy is consumed, not only by what they do, but by what they continuously override in themselves while they're doing it. And eventually that accumulated internal load has consequences. Not only emotionally, but cognitively, physically, mentally. Because the body doesn't simply forget all the moments it stayed alert, responsive, accommodating, prepared. It carries them forward. And after long enough, many women discover something unsettling. Even when nothing is urgent anymore, they still can't switch off. And because I know many women are recognising themselves very deeply in the conversations this season, I've created a small set of reflection resources to support you alongside the podcast. Not tools to fix yourself, just gentle prompts and frameworks to help you notice your own patterns of pressure, protection, and power more clearly. You'll find these in the show notes if you'd like them. One of the most difficult things about boundary collapse is that the moment rarely ends when the interaction ends. The conversation keeps going internally, long after the meeting finishes, long after the message is sent, long after everyone else has moved on. The nervous system stays active, replaying, reviewing, monitoring. Should I have said that differently? Did they seem upset? Was I too abrupt? Did I disappoint them? Should I send another message? Should I explain it better? This is one of the hidden forms of mental load many women carry constantly. Not just tasks, but relational residue, the unresolved emotional processing that continues long after the external moment has passed by. And because so much of this happens internally, it's often invisible even to the women carrying it. They simply experience themselves as tired, mentally busy, unable to switch off, unable to fully rest. But underneath that exhaustion, the nervous system is still working, still trying to restore a relational safety after the fact. This is particularly common for women who are highly relationally attuned, women who notice tone shifts, women who track emotional undercurrents, women who carry a strong sense of responsibility for how interactions feel. Because after a boundary moment, especially one that created tension, the nervous system often keeps scanning for evidence that the relationship is still okay. Did they reply differently? Was that message shorter than usual? Have I upset them? Are things weird now? Again, this isn't irrational. It's an attachment system trying to re-establish certainty. The body wants reassurance that connection remains intact. And until it feels that reassurance, part of the nervous system stays online, monitoring, preparing, thinking. This is why many women find it difficult to relax even after objectively small interactions. The interaction may have lasted 5 minutes. The internal processing may last 5 hours or 5 days. And over time, this creates enormous cognitive fatigue, not simply because women are doing too much, but because the nervous system is continuously carrying unresolved relational activation. This is also why many women struggle with true rest, because rest is not just the absence of task. Rest requires the nervous system to believe vigilance is no longer necessary. And for women whose systems are constantly monitoring emotional consequence, that vigilance rarely fully switches off. The body may stop moving, but internally something is still working. Reviewing conversations, anticipating needs, preparing responses, thinking ahead emotionally before anything's even happened. This is where many women begin describing a very particular kind of exhaustion. Not burnout exactly, more like never fully arriving at rest. The mind keeps looping. The body never quite softens. The nervous system remains partially braced. And eventually, women start assuming this is simply adulthood, leadership, responsibility, modern life. But often what they're carrying is the accumulated relational vigilance, the ongoing cognitive and emotional labour of trying to stay connected, safe, responsive, and emotionally prepared all the time. And this is why boundary work matters far beyond scheduling or workload. Because every boundary that collapses teaches the nervous system, stay alert, Stay available. Stay responsive. Keep monitoring. While every moment of internal coherence teaches something different, you can remain connected without abandoning yourself. You do not have to carry every emotional consequence alone. Not every discomfort requires repair. Not every tension is yours to resolve. That's a very different kind of safety. And when the nervous system starts learning that safety slowly, repeatedly, and consistently, something else becomes possible. Rest. Not shutdown, not exhaustion mistaken for rest, but actual nervous system settling. The kind where the body no longer feels responsible for holding every relationship together all the time. And for many women, that can feel unfamiliar at first, even uncomfortable. Because when vigilance has been active for years, stillness itself can feel exposed. But eventually, the system begins recognizing something new. Connection does not have to be maintained through constant self-monitoring. And once that begins shifting, the mind slowly becomes quieter too. Not because life suddenly becomes simple, but because the nervous system is no longer carrying quite so much unresolved emotional labour alone. And that's where we're going next, because in the next episode, I want to explore what happens when the body forgets how to fully stand down. When responsibility becomes internalised so deeply that even in quiet moments, the nervous system keeps preparing for what's next. When nothing is urgent anymore, and yet you still can't switch off. Thanks for joining me on the Archetype Effect. If this episode sparked an insight, share it with a woman who leads, or leave a review so more women can find these conversations. Until next time, lead with purpose and power that feels like you.